Click the bell icon to get latest videos from Ekeeda.
Hello friends, we'll be discussing certain details about how to use a suspense account when you have to go further with the rectification of errors. We have learned about basics, we have learned the advanced. We'll learn about certain more details about how to use a suspense account while you are rectifying any errors. So when we speak about suspense account, let's just briefly discuss about what suspense account is. Basically, suspense account is a temporary account which is created to further make sure that the trial balance is prepared. Now, let's give you an illustration or further, let's give you more details on this. In certain scenarios, it happens that there is one scenario or probably there is one situation where the trial balance is facing certain error, but it is the closure of the year and you cannot wait for all the balances to be rectified further and then going ahead with the preparation of trial balance all over again, because that is the long going process. And to cope up with this part, what accountants or accounting standards have further come up with is that a temporary account will be created to adjust the ledger balances, and then furthermore, going forward, all these ledger balances will be then rectified at a later stage so that all these details can be then provided for the preparation of financial statements like trading account, profit and loss account, and then balance sheet, which will give you a fair, clear picture about the company's standard or the company's financial position as of now. Now, in certain scenarios, when this happens, a suspense account which is created has to be adjusted later on. That means in the next year or probably in few months down the line. Or rather, when a suspense account is created, that is created with a reason here. Now, rectification of errors also has suspense account usage in it. In certain scenarios, maybe like the trial balance has been prepared and we have certain illustrations or other transactions which we have to go through in the later stage and understand how a suspense account is used to further go ahead and figure out what all details were required. Now, in this scenario, we have a suspense account illustration mentioned down here. Let's read it out first and understand each and every part in detail, after which we'll be understanding the specimen, that means the wrong entry, correct entry, and rectification entry, and then we'll post all these details one by one. So let's start with the illustration first. Now, in this problem, we'll assume that all these rectifications belongs to a trial balance of Mr. X. Let's assume. I'll mention it down on the question paper so that it will be more easy for you to understand as well. Now, we have mentioned down here that Mr. X is an assumption. So, that is what we'll be keeping in mind while mentioning all these questions. Let's go with the first illustration to understand more on it. The first illustration states that a credit item of 3490 has been debited to his personal account as 4390. In such a scenario, that means the item which was supposed to be credited for 3490 has been debited to Mr. X account as 4390. Now, when you're using a suspense account in such a scenario, you have to make sure that whatever errors have been made, two things have to be considered: the accounts and the amounts. So, account will be also considered whether it has to be debited or credited as per the situation, as well as the difference between the amount is also supposed to be considered. Likewise, we had such details when amount of X amount has been mentioned as Y or Y has been mentioned as Z, etc., etc. So you have to make sure all these errors are rectified according to that. So make sure in this illustration you make certain changes and we'll figure out how to use a suspense account in this. Now, the next transaction refers to a sum of 2650 which was written off as depreciation and machinery account hasn't been posted to depreciation account. That means that amount has been clearly segregated or subtracted from machinery account. However, no effect was mentioned in the depreciation account, because that is really necessary. Whenever a depreciation account is created, you have to post that amount or that amount as an expense in that account. But in this question, it wasn't done. So we'll understand how to use a suspense account in such a scenario. So the next transaction also refers as goods worth rupees 5,300 were given back by the customer. However, it was not mentioned into the sales return book. So there was a certain sale that was happened, out of which goods worth rupees 5,300 were sold back to us, or rather given back to us by a customer. We have taken it before the closing stock was valued. However, we never mentioned that into the sales written book. So what we need to do further here is that we need to use the suspense account, and whatever hasn't been mentioned will be mentioned, and suspense account will be a part of it. Now again, suspense account is created only to understand that all these details are necessary because the trial balance has been prepared and there are certain ledger balances that has been already closed. So that's the reason, if you can see from this illustration, they have mentioned that before closing or before getting the closing stock is derived only at the end of the financial year. So if you can understand, everything has been prepared. This is after the preparation of all these details, you are rectifying using a temporary account which can be later on adjusted or rectified further. Now, the next transaction refers to 4,800 which were due from Lakhanpal, which was mentioned as bad debts and was unexpectedly recorded and shown as a debit side of Lakhanpal itself. That means Lakhanpal, we was supposed to give certain amount to us amounting to rupees 4,800. It was mentioned into the books as a debit part of his. That means he has paid it, or he has rather given that amount to us. So this is what they have mentioned in this specific rectification of error illustration. Let's go on to the next one. The next one states sales book is undercast by 1500 rupees. So there is a shortage of sales book, or rather we can say that that amount is lower than the actual amount which was supposed to be, and the amount is 1500. So difference is 1500. You have to mention it using a suspense account here. Now the next transaction states that rupees 4,000 withdrawn as drawings, or rather expenses which are made for proprietary use, or drawings which were made for personal usage, was mentioned as general expenses. That means instead of drawing account, they have mentioned general expenses account here. So that is the rectification that we have to do. We'll figure out whether we need any kind of depreciation, or rather we can talk about any kind of suspense account in this category or not. We'll understand that when we try solving this illustration. Now the next transaction refers to machine purchased from Machine Mart for 18,000 was mentioned into the purchase book. That means instead of debiting that asset, we have debited purchase book here. So we have to figure out what is the mentioned amount, or what is the suspense account usage that can be posted in this specific transaction. Now we have paid cash worth rupees 1200 to Lakshman. However, we have mentioned that amount as a part of Ram Lakshman in 2100. That means we paid cash to Lakshman, which was amounting to rupees 1,200, but we have shown the same amount as a part of Ram. That means something which has been given to Ram instead of Lakshman, and the amount has been also mentioned as 2,100. So 1,200 was the actual amount. However, we have mentioned it as 2,100. Now, we've already understood all these transactions from the illustration. We'll further go ahead and prepare the illustration specimen, and then we'll figure out how to solve each of these illustration transactions so that rectification entry can be passed for all these transactions here. Let's figure it out. Now, in this instance, we have prepared the specimen. We'll first go with the illustration number 1 that has been mentioned, or the transaction number 1 that has been mentioned in this illustration, and we'll figure out how to pass the rectification entry for it. Now, we'll go with the illustration number 1 first. Now, if you see that there is a credit amount of 3490 which was supposed to be mentioned, however, it was been debited to his personal account as 4390. If you can see the difference between them, we can see that there is a difference of 900 which is supposed to be mentioned here. So instead of crediting that amount, we have mentioned it to the debit of his account. So we'll have to credit that amount and use the suspense account here. So we'll directly pass the suspense account transaction here. That means the journal entry. All these rectification and correct entry, wrong entry will be not applicable here. We'll just pass the rectification entry here. Now, if you can see that we have mentioned suspense account debit to Mr. X account. If you can see this illustration, they have mentioned that it has been debited to his personal account. That means Mr. X account was debited here. To nullify that effect, we'll credit that amount, or rather we'll credit Mr. X account and debit it with the suspense account here. So accordingly, the effect will be nullified, and the proper justification that is supposed to be required will be also mentioned or as a part of the rectification here. Now, let's go on to the second illustration, or the second part of this illustration. Now, the second illustration refers to a sum of rupees 2650, that means 2650, which was depreciated on machinery account, hasn't been posted to depreciation account. Now, depreciation is an expense. Machinery account has been already closed. So, instead of that, we'll have to pass the entry or rectification entry rather here as depreciation account debit because it hasn't been posted to suspense account because we have no other account to credit further. Now, if you can see, if we mentioned that transaction, let's go on to the third transaction and figure out what rectification of errors is supposed to be required using a suspense account here. Now, in the clear sense, there was a sales return for 5,300 which was not mentioned. Sales will have credit balance, sales return will have debit balance. So sales return will be debited with the amount of 5,300 and suspense account will be created with the same amount because as this transaction hasn't been recorded at all. Now the next transaction that refers to 4,800 which were due from Lakhanpal and which were rather written off as bad debts in the previous year unexpectedly recorded and mentioned to the debit side of his Lakhanpal account itself. That means his personal account was debited here. Now, if you see that his personal account was debited, to nullify that effect, his personal account will be credited here and that same amount will be mentioned as bad debts. As bad debts account is closed, suspense account will be used. So this is how the rectification entry is supposed to be passed here. Next, sales book is undercast by rupees 1,500. Sales credit which has been undercasted, that means less credited shown here. So sales book will be further credited here to bring it to the neutral level. Suspense account will be debited as there is no other account to debit further. Hence, all the books are closed. So this is how the rectification will be passed in this specific entry. Now, the next transaction that refers to, there was a drawing which was done by the proprietor for worth rupees 4,000. However, it was debited to general expense account. I'll purposely mention down the entry which is supposed to be done and will further evaluate what is the necessity of how drawing is supposed to be mentioned here. Now, drawing is a withdrawal or reduction in the value of capital. That is something that you already know. So if there is any drawing, it is not an expense for the company. However, it is reduction in the capital. So capitals to drawing is the amount that is supposed to be mentioned or is the journal entry that is supposed to be mentioned. However, they have mentioned it as a general expense here. So the correct entry is capital account debit to drawing account, which is a reduction in the value of the capital. They're mentioned instead of capital general expenses here. So the rectification entry will be general expenses will be credited and capital amount will be debited here. So there is no usage of suspense account as such in this specific scenario. So this is how you pass the rectification entry for all these transactions. Let's go on to the next sheet and prepare the rectification entry for the balance 3 transactions here. Now, the next transaction that refers to there is an amount or rather there is a transaction that was done. Machine was purchased for an amount of 18,000 from Machine Mart. However, it was recorded into the purchase book. That means instead of debiting machine account, they have debited purchase book here. Let's pass the correct entry and then figure out what would be the rectification entry here after passing the wrong entry post that. So if you can see, the correct entry is machine account debit to cash, assuming that the cash was given while the purchase was done and there was no credit. But instead of that, they have mentioned in the wrong entry as purchase account debit to cash. Now we'll pass the rectification entry here. Although if you were using suspense account, instead of the rectification entry, that means machine account debit to purchase account, we can also pass suspense account debit to purchase account. So these are the two kind of rectifications that you can pass for this specific entry. Let's figure out the last transaction here. Now, there was a transaction that was mentioned here. Cash paid 1,200 to Lakshman was credited to Ram's account as 2,100. So we'll pass the correct entry first to understand what is the transaction nature and then figure out what is the wrong entry that has been passed here. So if you can see, we have passed the rectification entry here. That means the correct entry would have been Lakshman to cash. However, the wrong entry that has been passed here is Lakshman to Ram. So to rectify this, we have debited Ram's account with 2,100, whereas the cash account has been mentioned with the actual amount that is 1,200 and the difference has been mentioned in the suspense account here. So this is how you will be posting the journal entries so that rectification is done. So This is how the rectification is supposed to be mentioned in all these cases of rectification of errors, especially while using suspense account, or rather when you have to create a suspense account, which is a temporary account to make sure that the flaws or errors in any kind of journal entries, ledger balances, posting of wrong account, wrong amount, etc., can be dealt of later in the next stage. But before that, we have to prepare the trial balance and then give out the statements of financial accounts, that is trading account, profit and loss account, balance sheet, which will further help you give the correct financial statement or the correct financial position of the company to the external and internal users, because that is the process that cannot stop because of these errors. So this is just a way out to rectify those errors using a suspense account, but has to be adjusted in the later stage. So I hope this illustration gave you a lot of experience about how a suspense account is supposed to be utilized whenever in such scenarios of rectification of errors. So thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned with eKida and keep subscribing to eKida.